You'll miss it. The Ethical Humanism of the Future with Dr. Anne Klaeysen. I have a whole bio here for anyone who hasn't met her. Anne Klaeysen is a leader of the New York Society for Ethical Culture. She holds a Doctor of Ministry degree in Pastoral Counseling from Hebrew Union College, as well as a master's degree in German from the State University of New York at Albany, and Business Administration from New York University. Dr. Klaeysen is the Ethical Humanist Religious Life Advisor at Columbia University and Humanist Chaplain at NYU. She also participates in several interfaith social justice coalitions, and she is our beloved leader. So. Okay. I will.
Thank you for coming. We have folks here with hearing aids.
Okay, let's get started. The Sunday Program Committee has asked me to make sure that whenever I have a poem, which I always do, to make sure that I give you copies. And so you have copies of my opening and closing poems, and if you'd like to read along, you certainly may. Mary Oliver. I know she's a favorite. I see some heads nodding. Mary Oliver is a favorite of many of us. And this is called Mindful. Every day, I see or hear something that more or less kills me with delight, that leaves me like a needle in the haystack of light. It is what I was born for, to look, to listen, to lose myself inside this soft world, to instruct myself over and over in joy and acclamation. Nor am I talking about the exceptional, the fearful, the dreadful, the very extravagant, but of the ordinary, the common, the very drab. The daily presentations, oh good scholar, I say to myself, how can you help but grow wise with such teachings as these? The untrimmable light of the world, the oceans shine, the prayers that are made out of grass. Thank you, Sarah, for presiding this morning, for introducing me. You and I have shared with one another in the course of our conversations, because I am her mentor for leadership training, and proudly so, our challenges with founder Felix Adler. And we've both become quite fond of him. Although he did not support women's suffrage and believed that the highest calling of women was motherhood, he did bring Anna Garland Spencer here. And she, together with Jane Addams, an ethical culture lecturer in Chicago and founder of Hull House, founded the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, the Ethical Summer School. She also started the School of Philanthropy at Columbia, which is now the School of Social Work. So thank you, Felix, for having brought Anna to us. Today, I invite you to look at the portrait of Felix Adler hanging on the east wall between the windows overlooking Central Park West. Imagine him as a 6-year-old boy, traveling with his parents, Samuel and Henrietta, and his older brother, Isaac, from Alzey, Germany, to New York City, where his father, the youngest son in a family with a long tradition in the rabbinate, would become the rabbi of Temple Emanu-El. His sister Sarah was born in this country that would soon be torn apart by the Civil War. Felix was 10 years old when that war started in 1861, and years later he wrote that the liberation of the slaves should be treated as the starting point for the social mission of the American Republic. It was certainly the starting point for his personal consciousness of American social and political ideals. Now imagine Felix, not yet bald, at 22 years old. He had returned to New York City from his rabbinic studies in Germany on September 15th, 1873. On October 6th, the Board of Trustees of Temple Emanu-El invited him to speak at the coming Sabbath on Saturday, October 11th. It was to be his trial run. Yeah, hey Dave. It's a hearing. Oh, it's Cy's hearing aid. Oh, I'm sorry about that, Cy. Yeah, that's okay, Cy. I assumed it was up here. Okay. That's okay. I'm going to speak louder. Imagine Felix Adler at 22. He's just come back from his studies in Germany, and he gets this invitation from the Board of Trustees that he's to speak on Saturday, October 11th. This is in 1873. It would be his first public expression of his fundamental religious message, born from his educational experience abroad. Everyone expected him to one day take his father's place, so he read his sermon aloud to his father the night before. Here are some highlights from that sermon, which he called the Judaism of the Future. After telling the story of how Reformed Judaism swept away the ruins of tradition and established a new house, he tells them that in Europe, where he's just been, where the Reformed Judaism movement took its origin, what spectacle meets the eye, he says. Stagnation everywhere. Hopes that were once so high changed into hopeless indifference. The question is, Felix says, life or death? Is religion about to perish? Well, that grabbed their attention. He goes on to say, it is not religion which is old, it is your mode of cultivating it which is antiquated. Again shall the genius of mankind awaken, new form will replace the old, new institutions call forth the religious powers of the human heart more intensely than ever before. And then he turns his attention to his audience and reminds them, as if they needed reminding, of what a commanding position you have built up for yourselves in the world of commerce. After a few decades have passed since you came to the shores of this new land, homeless, friendless, shelterless. And he tells them, the ideal powers are slumbering within you. You cannot stand still, for to stand still is to be crushed. We must progress. Well, they thought they were doing pretty well, thank you very much. They had succeeded over several decades here in the United States. They had brought Reformed Judaism with them. They had brought the Adler family over to Germany to be with them. So they're already wondering, what's this young upstart talking about? We're expecting him to bring the lessons that he's learned about Reformed Judaism that's being taught in Germany and to bring those back to us. They're expecting an exegesis of the scripture. That's not what they got. We must progress. It is necessary that first principles should be made clear before last results can be comprehended. And so what he suggests is In the place of opinion, to establish conviction. In the place of vague belief, firm and self-conscious hope. Educate the masses, he says. Send light into dark corners, he says. Not the creed, but the deed. Does that sound familiar? Right. When you come into our lobby, you see deed above creed. He's testing it out on the congregation at Temple Emanu-El. He goes on. Religion, not confined to church and synagogue alone, shall go forth into the marketplace, shall sit by the judge in the tribunal, by the counselor in the hall of legislation, shall stand by the merchant in his warehouse, by the workman at his work. In every department of life, wherever man's activity is unfolded, its quickening influences shall be felt. Religion and life shall be wedded once more in inseparable union. Well, that was a lot to take in. It was a lot to take in because they had become quite well satisfied in their congregation of Temple Emanu-El. They were very well heeled, and they were making significant charitable contributions. They were good people, but he's asking more of them. And he acknowledges that he's only 22 years old. He acknowledges, I'm only a mere youth, but he asks that they not be impatient with him, speaking thus boldly and fervently, for, quote, it is the cause of purest wisdom that I would defend, the greatest cause of the ideal, the universality of Judaism. Regardless of their beliefs or disbeliefs, the elastic power of religion, that it will expand with the growth of science. So he certainly talks about science. I don't think anyone disagreed with him about science, but can never in truth collide with it, science. But here's where he challenges them. We discard the narrow spirit of exclusion and loudly proclaim that Judaism was not given to the Jews alone, but that its destiny is to embrace in one moral state the whole family of man. He calls for a temple of the future, justice its foundation, peace and goodwill its columns, and the vast firmament of heaven itself, its high dome. He concludes, its great humanitarian doctrine, its eternal watchword, one truth, one love, one hope in the highest, and one brotherhood of men on earth. Well, the reactions. There were very positive reactions, and two of the Jewish publications at the time received it quite well and said that the congregation had received it well. And certainly the young people heard him and liked what he had to say. There was, however, one person who did not like it, and his name was Gustav Gottheil. He was his father Samuel's associated rabbi, and he had only arrived in New York City in September, probably around the same time that Felix came back. He had come over from Manchester, England, after a prolonged search by the Board of Trustees for an English-speaking Reformed rabbi. And he was shocked by what he called an address. That's no sermon, that's an address. And so what does he do? He galvanizes the opposition among the older, more conservative members, and he threatens to resign. Later on, Gustav's son Richard said, Dr. Adler's views on religious matters differed from his so widely, it would be manifestly impossible for the two to work together. So you gotta kind of imagine, what's going on here, right? The whole family, the whole Adler family, the congregation, they're waiting for Felix to come home, to make a big splash, to take over. And here's this rabbi who's gotta feel the competition. And he's saying, that's it, it's him or me. So he says, the most important thing about this sermon was he never mentioned God, and I don't think he believes in God. I think Felix is an atheist. And so a committee is sent to ask him, was his omission of God intentional? Did he in fact believe in God? Now, as I said, Felix had read the sermon aloud to his father, and he and Samuel, it kind of didn't jump out at them that this was going to be a problem. So he's thinking about it, and he acknowledges that superficially, the omission was unintentional. But now that you mention it, I really don't believe in your God. That exclusion really was a new religious departure for me. Years later, he wrote, is it right for a teacher of religion who adheres to the new to enter the old pulpit for the purpose of gradually preparing men to accept the new? I say no, because he would be entering under false pretenses. The teacher who under such circumstances accepts or retains his position may have the best ends in view, but the means are dishonest, and the best ends do not justify such means. So I wonder, had Gustav not threatened to resign, had Felix not recognized that he couldn't in good conscience stay and preach something new from an old pulpit, would we be here today? Would there be an ethical culture? And I think the answer is no, because he really needed to start something new, and it wasn't going to happen at Temple Emanu-El. And so we celebrate Founders Day in May because on the 15th of May in 1876, Felix Adler founds Ethical Culture. And in similar fashion to this other sermon, it's an address. It really is. And he talks about, in that founding address, about how the social ills are so overwhelming that in the aftermath of the Civil War, we have become an industrialized nation that has destroyed men's lives and souls. Indeed, there are children working in our factories. They're working in the fields, in the coal mines. How can we stand that? We must do something. And then he calls attention to all the different faiths that differ with one another and how people fight about it and even kill each other over it. Just, that's got to stop too. And so he starts Ethical Culture, which for him was an ethical religion, but which he says, it's okay if it's not your religion, but let's be together in developing a culture that promotes ethics. And so that's why we're here today. That's what he started. I'm asking you to kind of imagine yourself at all these different ages of Felix, and imagine what were you doing at those different times? When you were 6, with your family. When you were 10, and a civil war breaks out. When you're 22, addressing a congregation and your family. By the way, his family was heartbroken. But his father continued to support him and came to his founding address and continued to support him because he loved and trusted his son. So if we think back, what were we doing at those times? And what were we learning at those times? What were we doing? What were we caring about? Whom did we love? I mean, the love in that family must have been tremendous because he went up to Cornell, up to Ithaca, to teach for a while. New York City was a little too hot for him. And even there, kind of anecdotally, he was very popular with the students at Cornell, but some of the trustees felt that he was an atheist, again with the atheism, and so they decided that they wouldn't accept any more money to fund that chair, and he comes back 3 years later in 1876. Thank goodness, to start ethical culture. He talks about that practical religion that is intimately involved in all aspects of social concern and not limited to a church, to a synagogue, to a mosque, to a meeting house. That takes us outside, not only outside our physical space, but outside our comfort zones to act, always to act. So what are our first principles today? What must we make clear as he made clear? There are many things. But I think in similar fashion to Felix hoping for a universality of Judaism because of its moral law, I think it's important for us to look at real diversity, not superficial. We've made a very good start here. We have social justice alliances. We've made a very good start because we know that given the size of our congregation, we can't do all these things on our own, that we must make meaningful and deep partnerships, and we're doing that. We strive to be good allies. But are we also good accomplices? And I use that word because that's a word that was used by a millennial group in St. Louis a few years ago, when the American Ethical Union Assembly met and gave the Elliott Black Award to a group of young African Americans. And you can imagine when this lovely group of African Americans and their families were there, looked out on an audience predominantly white and older, much older than they, and were kind of wondering, gosh, they're giving us this award for moral courage. They know our story, they want to hear from us. They're our allies. So they ask, can you also be our accomplices? Can you also understand what it is to risk what we risk every day? Are you willing to risk? What are you willing to risk? And so I think it's important for us to bring in new voices and not just bring them in a superficial way, but really listen deeply. So, of course, I can number them. The first, identify yourselves as ethical humanists, ethical culturists, humanists, whatever you want to use, but identify yourself. Throw off the cloak of being a non-joiner and embrace this identity. Know your values, your humanist values, and promote them. We had a speaker here this summer who spoke to that, Michael Thompson, and he said, we really need to be out there and not to be shy about who we are, what is important, what we value. That's number one. Identify. Wear it on your sleeve. Tell everybody. Shout it from the mountains. Number two, learn about other humanisms. Ours is not the only one. And I don't only mean that we are religious humanists who organize ourselves congregationally, or the American Humanist Association that organizes itself secularly in chapters. I also mean the other humanisms from African Americans, from Muslims, from Christians. Tony Pinn has spoken here before. I hope he returns. He and I were mentors of the former Humanist Institute. As an African American, he's written a great deal about how he embodies humanism. It's not just something that he kind of puts on and off. That's who he is in his whole identity. Monica Miller spoke here at the beginning of the month when we hosted the Humanist Symposium. And she refers to African American groups that aren't calling themselves humanists, but are acting in humanist ways, and we need to learn more about them. An example is hip hop. It is very humanist in the sense that it not only celebrates music and poetry, but it forms a community and takes care of one another. There's something also very embodied about the movement of hip hop, feeling one's whole self. And then there's Sikivu Hutchinson. And this is what she writes. And those of you who came to my last humanist class will be familiar with this quote. As an African American feminist, I subscribe to humanism because it is a belief system based on the view that humanity defines morals, ethics, and notions of justice. A radical humanist vision eschews religious and social hierarchies of race, gender, sexuality, and class because they undermine the universal human rights and self-determination of oppressed peoples. Radical humanism rejects the notion that there is only one way to be Black or Latino, and that women and the LGBT community are marginal and morally aberrant. So again, she's identifying herself and she's inviting us to learn more about her and more about other humanisms that may practice their faith in the goodness of humanity in different ways than we do. 3, cultivate the moral and intellectual humility that will open you up to the experience of others and offer yourself to the leadership of others. Let's have a virtual settlement house. John Lovejoy Elliott, who established Hudson Guild in Chelsea as a settlement house, part of that settlement house movement with Jane Addams, really put into practice ethical culture values in the sense that by being a good neighbor and offering opportunities, physical and temporal spaces for people to experience themselves, we act in ways to elicit that goodness. We act in ways to elicit their uniqueness. And that part of them that we need to be whole, to be part of that ethical manifold. So let's think about a virtual settlement house where we are humble and open to the experiences of others and are with them, allies, accomplices, follow their lead. Monica's going to tell you about what's going on tomorrow, but I will use that as an example of how the climate strike on Friday and our event tomorrow is offering the gift of that first generation of this meeting house to youth environmental activists who met here, who trained one another, and who are putting on the program that you will see tomorrow, who are leading us because their future depends on it, and we have let them down. Finally, let's understand our future as a non-linear process that with twists and turns and fits and starts. And Sarah, this is something you and I have talked about as well, in the sense that Felix Adler in 1876 and all those white men who signed the first Humanist Manifesto in 1933, they believed in a linear progress towards perfection. And they were bitterly disappointed because that's not the way the world works. That's not the way life works. It's a process, and it must involve all of us. And it's going to go around in a spiral, if any shape at all, but certainly not in a linear progress leading towards some kind of perfection. So, with all of that in mind, that it's a process, that we need to cultivate humility, that we need to learn about other humanisms, and we need to identify ourselves as ethical humanists, I now close with the second poem. Naomi Shihab Nye. And you've heard this poem before because it's one of my favorites, and I think it is because I'm a mom. And when we were driving here this morning, we saw a man we presumed to be a father with one child in the backpack and another child in his arms crossing the street. So with him in mind, and with all of you in my heart, shoulders. A man crosses the street in rain, stepping gently, looking 2 times north and south, because his son is asleep on his shoulder. No car must splash him. No car drive too near to his shadow. This man carries the world's most sensitive cargo, but he's not marked. Nowhere does his jacket say, fragile, handle with care. His ear fills up with breathing. He hears the hum of a boy's dream deep inside him. We're not going to be able to live in this world if we're not willing to do what he's doing with one another. The road will only be wide. The rain will never stop falling. If we're lucky, the train will come. The rain will never stop. And now, as a segue to our shared charity,